Mi chiamo Thomas Covin, sono francese e sono il presidente della Federazione Internazionale di Public History. Parlo italiano perché faccio il mio dottorato a Firenze, però ho deciso oggi di parlare inglese, è molto più comodo per me. Allora parlo adesso in inglese. Good morning. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you today, but I'm very glad to be part of that conference and this discussion on our history and public history. Um, I will, at the end of the presentation, give you my contact so that if you have any question or if you want to discuss about my presentation, I would be happy to answer your questions. So today, I want to talk about oral history and public history theory and practices in the United States. I've been teaching and doing public history in the United States since 2013. And I will show you both the video that you can see and this PowerPoint to give you more details about my presentation. The relationship between oral history and public history is very important. And when I moved to the US, I thought that the golden age in the beginning of oral history was in the 1960s. And actually, when I moved there, I learned a lot about oral history in the US in the 1930s. So I'm going to talk a lot about the links between oral history and public history, even before the public history movement was created in the 1970s. I think it's also important to discuss this connection between oral history and public history in Italy, because Italy has been a very important place for oral history. You have some of the best oral historians, and more recently, you just for the creation of the Italian Association for Public History, which is the first national association outside the US. So I think this conference and this discussion is taking place in a very important context. So I will try to discuss oral history and public history with also a basic question: to what extent is oral history a form of public history? At first, it could be simple and we could say yes, but we're going to see that the definition and the approach of public history changed, so that the connection between oral history and public history have changed as well. For example, Mark Fuller from Cleveland in 2014 said, "It's given that oral history can't be public history if it's cache of CDs or transcript squirreled away in a drawer. Is it any less clear than an interview collection, no matter how voluminous, historically significant, or methodologically rigorous, also falls short of the mark when it rests in a library?" So basically, he's saying that oral history is public history when it's used as a public project. So we're going to see that the links between oral history and public history are not that obvious, or not always very obvious. So today I will divide my talk into three parts. The first one will be about historiography, so the rise of oral history in the US, the rise of public history, and how they connected. The second aspect would be about basically how public history changed in the 1990s and 2000s, and how this new approach of the public had an impact on oral history too. And finally, I will say a few things about teaching public history and oral history in the US, how it's done, and what skills are used. So first of all, talking about historiography. There's been a long practice of oral history in the United States, and I'm giving you a few examples. One of the earliest examples is the Federal Writers Project that was developed in the 1930s during the Great Depression. So basically the project was to give some project to historians, but not only historians, to interview people. Especially this project was famous for interviewing former slaves in the 1920s and 1930s. So you had more than 1,200 interviews in the 1930s that contributed to the development of oral history in the United States. Another major aspect was the creation of the Columbia in New York City, the Columbia Oral History Research Office in 1948 by Allen Nevins. And this is seen as one of the early steps in the professionalization of oral history, in the methodology, preservation, and techniques of oral history. So from the beginning in the United States, oral history was linked to the federal government and public policy. And we will see that this early approach of oral history explained the initial connection between oral history and public history. So now let's move to when public history as a movement was created in the 1970s. So the connection between oral history and public history in the 1960s and 1970s. In the 1960s in the US, but not only, there was a new approach on ordinary people to move away from only talking, researching the elites, but doing much more about ordinary people and everyday life. And this contributed to a renewal of oral history in the 1960s that we can clearly see indeed in Italy as well. So there was much more interest in everyday life, in workers, in popular culture in the 1960s. And this was part of something very, very important. When we talk about public history, we have to be careful to distinguish between public history as a movement created and developed in the 1970s, I will talk about it, and public practice for historians. And public practices are older than public history. Historians had public practice in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, in archives, in museums. So we have to distinguish, right? And in the 1960s, oral history and oral historians were doing some public practice of history. They were not doing public history yet, but they were doing some public practice. And this contributed to the fact that Robert Kelly, as you can see on the screen from the University of California, Santa Barbara, created the first public history program in the early 1970s. And this is seen as the beginning of the public history movement in the United States. It led to the creation of the National Council on Public History in 1979, the creation of the Public Historian, which is the Journal of Public History, in 1978. So this was what we could say as the institutionalization of public history. Public history taught, practiced in universities in the United States in the mid-70s, right? So this is the beginning of the public history movement in the United States. And this movement, public history, why was public history taught and developed in universities? There are a few reasons. According to the text and the founding members of the public history movement, there were three major reasons for the development of public history. One was to answer a job crisis. There were too many, PhD doctorates and not enough jobs. So Robert Kelly and others thought that they needed to expand the careers for historians to answer the job crisis, to find jobs in public policy, in museums, for instance. The second reason was to broaden the definition of historical practice, right? History was not only the history taught in schools. So you could do history, you can be an historian and work outside of education. And that's the last point, to acknowledge historians working outside academia. You had many, and you still have many historians who do not work in universities. Still, they are professional historians. So the public history movement wanted to reconnect all those different historians under the umbrella of public history. So this is the beginning of public history as a movement in the 1970s. It's very important to see what part played oral history and oral historians in the beginning of that movement, because we can see connection, but we're going to see that the specific definition of public history in the 1970s had an impact. And we're going to see that public history in the 1970s was mostly perceived as what we could say today applied history in public policy. So a very specific approach of the field, right? Just to give you an example, the Public Historian, which is the journal of the public history movement, the very first issue of the journal in 1978, you had an article from Arthur Henthen, who was the director of the oral history program at California State University. And you can see on the right some excerpt of his article, and he was saying, I'm quoting, "In this regard, I am especially concerned that your journal include articles demonstrating the nexus between the technique of oral history, so the technique, and the areas of public policy analysis, community planning, and cultural resource studies." So he wanted public history to develop, to explain the links between the technique of oral history, very important, and a specific field of public policy. The other quote says, "What the public historian can accomplish, however, is to focus attention on how private businesses and public agencies might utilize oral history as a people-centered device for developing viable strategies for dealing with questions like housing, transportation, recreation, energy, education, and the like." So he was very aware of the possibility to use oral history for a very specific aspect of public history, which is public policy. So working with business, working with the federal government. So maybe not the oral history that we think about the 1960s on popular culture, on workers, on ordinary people. So the first connection between public history and oral history was not about museums or public participation. It was about using oral history for public policy, federal government, policy analysis, business, for-profit companies. So it is a very specific use of oral history in the 1970s. So we are in the 1970s. This slightly changed in the 1990s, the relation between oral history and public history. That's what I call the second wave of public history in the 1990s and 2000s. Today, the definition of public history is different from the 1970s. So are the connection between oral history and public history. So in the 1990s, you had new forms of public history. Public history transformed, changed, and this is important to understand the connection with oral history. Public history was much more about communication, no longer only about public policy or business, but much more on communication. With cultural institutions, museums, as you can see on the image on the right, oral history and public history used in exhibition in museums, radio station. So you had a focus on communication. History communicated to larger audiences in the 1990s. And this affected the connection between oral history and public history. Oral history was no longer used only for business or public policy, but to convey emotions, for example, in exhibitions. So museums started to use oral history to convey emotion, to reenact the past. Oral history was used to communicate history. So you had radio programs using oral history to communicate history in the 1990s. So a very different use of oral history by public history institutions. So oral history was no longer only a primary source, but it was a way to communicate history to larger audiences. We come here to a public use of oral history. In my second point, I wrote that public history became also more participatory, so involving the public. And this is a major change in public history in the 1990s. I quoted one single book, which I think has been very, very important in the new wave of public history. The book was written in 1919, or published in 1919, by Michael Frisch. Michael Frisch is an oral historian. He was actually the guest speaker last year in Ravenna at the International and Italian Conference on Public History. And he wrote this book entitled A Shared Authority, Essays on the Craft and Meaning of Oral and Public History. We are at the core here of the connection between oral and public history. His concept of shared authority became very famous, right? Frisch started from oral history and the co-construction of the historical narrative. Because in oral history, you use the narrator to construct history, so you share authority. And Michael Frisch was applying this concept of shared authority or co-construction to the whole field of public history. So starting from oral history, moving to public history, right? So the impact was huge on the new definition of oral history. Because historians, according to that definition, do by definition share authority with others, right? So that encourages, that develop public participation, not only in oral history, but in every aspect of public history. And it embodies a turn in public history from purely and only public policy, applied history, business, cooperation, to broader public participation in history construction. And this connection between oral history, public history, shared authority had an impact and consequences on projects. I wanted to show you a few examples of those wonderful links between oral history and public history. One field is about activism and ethnic minorities. In the year 2000s, you had more and more discussion about activism for public history and how historians can be activists and work with especially ethnic minorities. The approach, the objective was to give voices to people who have been ignored in the public sphere. So mostly ethnic minorities like the LGBT, the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender communities, or other ethnic minorities like immigrants or workers. So many new projects and programs wanted to give voices to these communities. And how do you give voices to communities? You use oral history. So you here have an important transformation and use of oral history to apply this shared authority and activism policy. So I gave you the example of the LGBT, and you have on the right, you have this project and this website, which is an oral history hub, a repository of oral history archives for the LGBT community. It's called the Digital History Collaboratory Project, right, that you can find online. And the website, this website tells you also about how important new technology have helped the connection between oral history and public history. You have a very famous website in the US, which is Oral History in the Digital Age, that gives details, tips, resources to use oral history on the web and to make it participatory. So oral history and public history through the digital tools. So this is a very good example of the evolution of the relation, the links between oral history and public history since the year 2000. Another development of oral history and public history has been about storytelling. Storytelling is becoming a buzzword in public history and in history in general. And the origins of storytelling are quite old. One very important aspect in the historiography was, in the 1930s, the concept of everybody is an historian. Everybody can be an historian, right? So in public history, you have this trend in giving the floor to people to be their own historian. And it is particularly obvious through storytelling and digital tools, because you may be aware of many social media, but also MySpace, which is quite old now, but which was the origin of storytelling for people. So the web and digital tools gave people access and ways to record themselves and to provide their own storytelling. And this is another major change in the links between public history, digital history, and oral history. To give you only one example, StoryCorps. StoryCorps was created in 2003, so it's 15 years old now. And the concept of StoryCorps is basically to give the floor to people to record themselves. So you can see on the right this trailer, StoryCorps, moving trailer that goes from cities, from places to places where people can record themselves. You have an example from Detroit on the bottom right in which people interview each other. And we come here to a very specific aspect of StoryCorps. It's not an historian recording a narrator. It's people recording themselves. So here you have two examples of people asking each other questions. And this has been a very popular project in the United States, earning several grant projects since 2013. And I give you the principle of StoryCorps. I think it's symbolic of the push for more public participation. It's a push for more participatory history. My problem, and I'm not the only one, is about the role of historians. Right? Where are historians? You do not see them here. For example, this is a short introduction about StoryCorps, a short video. And in that video, you have the founder of StoryCorps, Dave Isay, who's interviewed by his nephew on the left. So you can hear basically the interview online. The problem is, where is the historian? Is that history, right? How do people know what questions to ask, right? StoryCorps provide teaching lessons and guides to formulate your questions. But still, where is the historian? Where is the historical interpretation? So that's part of the big discussion now about how far can we go in giving the floor to people. Is the historian absent? Is it just a facilitator? What's the role of historians? And it's not only about our history. You have these questions about historians for digital project, crowdsourcing. What is the role of historians, right? Interpreting, giving the floor, where are they? So this is very problematic in the new relations between oral history, public history, and digital history. Instead of StoryCorps, I've been using that app, PicStory, that you can find online. It's free. And this digital app, was created by Michael Frisch, again, the historian who wrote the book on shared authority. So it's an app developed a few years ago, 3 years ago now, that you can use on your cell phone. And it's pretty easy. The concept is you take a picture, so it could be a picture of a site, an object, or anything, and then you record your own stories about the object, and you publish it online, on social media, on platforms, and so on. So share the story behind your picture, as the image says. And I've been using that app for my public history class. So it's another connection between oral history and public history. On the bottom left, you have a picture of two of my students during a history harvest, which is basically collecting objects from people. It was in Louisiana in 2015. And you have on the right, you have someone from the public bringing objects. It was about music. And I asked my students to use PicStory to record stories about objects. So they were using their cell phone, recording stories about object. So they took a picture of an object, they had the stories, and then we used them online for an exhibit. And I prefer that app to StoryCorps because my students were able to use the stories and to confront the stories with their own research on the object. So you cross-archive the stories, the oral history, the object, and the research. In that sense, I think PicStory may be a very good tool to connect oral history and questions maybe asked by researchers or historians or students object, and the past. That example leads me to the last part of my talk, which is about teaching, right? In the US. Teaching, and how do you teach oral and public history in the US? I've been in the US for 6 years now, and I've been teaching public history for 6 years. And I wrote a textbook that you can see on the left on public history, in which I have one chapter about oral history. And in that chapter, which is mostly skill-oriented, I talk about materials for oral history, the setup, what kind of questions, preservation of oral history, the uses of oral history, and ethics. And I've been using oral history in most of my courses. I haven't taught a class on oral history per se, but I've been teaching a different class in public history in which I use oral history. For example, I've been teaching documentary film, I've been teaching about museums, and in all those courses, I use oral history. And I think the skills are very important. And I'm not the only one, because in the US you have more than 200 public history programs, mostly graduate programs. And most of them use oral history, not in one course on oral history, but in other courses. So this is a very important field in the US. But again, the way you teach oral history in the US is mostly project-oriented, skill-oriented, right? Much more the practice than the theory of oral history. But I still think that through the practice of oral history, you can learn a lot about public history theory as well. I give you the example of Nguyen Schwender book, Oral History and the Law, that I use to teach about copyrights, ethics in public history, right? Not only ethics between the client and the historian, but ethics between historian and communities, historian and the narrator. So this is something that I believe is very important and could be even more developed in the US and abroad, using oral history to test and discuss the question of practice and theory of ethics and relation between communities. I have a very specific example about oral history. A very famous case study from Boston College, so in the US. And Boston College started this project, oral history project, a few years ago about Northern Ireland, right? And so the idea was to interview former IRA, so Irish Republican Army members. And the deal was that Boston College would interview those former IRA members, but will not publish the interview until they die, right? So from their living, the interviewees, the narrators will not have any issue with justice. So whatever they say, Boston College agreed not to publish the interviews. But because the materials were so sensitive and so important, that the British authorities asked for the publication of the oral history sources. So they launched a trial and a dispute, legal dispute, in which ultimately the Boston College had to publish the oral history project, despite what they had agreed with their interviewees. So it's a very good case of public history, copyright, community relations, and oral history. So I use that example to connect oral history and the practice and theory of public history. To conclude, one can definitely say that oral history is connected to public history, but oral history is connected to public history through the uses and the public participation, right? And in that sense, oral history and its old history, its old historiography, can help public history to develop more theory and discussion about the field. Again, the use of history and the public participation are key in both oral history and public history. And I strongly believe that because oral history have been there for a pretty long time, right? Several decades. I believe that oral history can help people to better understand public history, right? Because people have more issues understanding and developing public history, which is not always clear, right? But people have a better understanding of what oral history is. And I think that in Italy, especially with the oral history tradition, I think oral history can be used to explain what public history is, what public history can do, and this could lead to a development of broader project of public history, especially since, as you have seen, the Italian Association for Public History is a great success. And I believe that the link between oral history and public history in Italy are something we need to discuss even more than we do today. So thank you for your attention. Unfortunately, I cannot answer your questions, but I just put my email so that you can ask me any question. And if you're interested about the International Federation, this is the email that you can do. So thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you will have a great discussion. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.